I was 81 when I moved into my son's house. I still remember how carefully he said it, as if he were asking a skittish animal to come closer. We were standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I had cooked his school lunches and packed his father's dinners, back when my hands were stronger and my knees didn't complain every time I turned. The morning light was coming through the curtains, and the table was covered with mail I hadn't opened yet. I'd been pretending not to see it. Bills make a certain kind of sound when you touch them, like dry leaves. "Mom," he said, "we've got the extra room. It doesn't make sense for you to keep doing this alone." Doing this alone meant living in a small house that suddenly felt too big, and pretending I didn't hear the refrigerator hum too loudly at night. It meant standing at the sink, looking at a stack of dishes, and having to sit down halfway through because my back tightened. It meant calling my neighbor to carry a laundry basket down the basement steps and then feeling ashamed for needing help with something I'd done for 60 years. I told him no at first. Not loudly. Just quietly, like a reflex. I said, "I'm fine." And he looked at me the way sons do when they're trying to be respectful but have already decided. He didn't argue. He just waited until I ran out of reasons. My daughter-in-law was there too, sitting at my table with her hands wrapped around a mug she didn't drink from. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she wore a light sweater even though my kitchen was warm. She smiled at me in a way that was polite, correct. The kind of smile you give someone you're prepared to take care of, but also prepared to manage. "We'll make it easy for you," she said. "No stress. You'll have your own space." I remember nodding, because nodding is what I did when I was tired and didn't want to make trouble. They were kind to me in those first days. I want to say that clearly. I don't like stories where an older woman becomes a prop for someone else's cruelty right away, as if people can't be decent before they become something else. My son brought my boxes in himself. He insisted on carrying the heavier ones, even when his shoulders were tight from work. He set my chair near the living room window so I could sit and watch the backyard. He made sure the hallway nightlight was plugged in. My daughter-in-law arranged my clothes in the closet and lined my shoes up under the hanging rack. She put a small vase of flowers on the dresser, white ones, simple, like something from a grocery store. She placed my framed photo of my late husband on the nightstand without asking, as if she understood the importance of putting the dead where the living can still glance at them. On my first night there, I lay awake in their guest room and listened. I heard the house settle the way all houses do. I heard the dishwasher run. I heard my son's footsteps above me, moving from room to room, and then quiet. In the morning, I got up early because my body still believed in early mornings. I walked down the hall slowly, careful of the unfamiliar floor, and I found the kitchen. It was brighter than mine, newer, with clean counters and cabinets that closed softly. I stood there for a moment, not touching anything. When you're old, you learn that the smallest thing, where you put a mug, how you fold a towel, can become a way of marking territory. I decided I would be a good guest. That's what I told myself. I made coffee the way I always had, measuring carefully, trying not to clatter. I rinsed the spoon and dried it. I wiped a few drops off the counter. It wasn't fear. It was habit. I had been a woman who noticed details. I had kept a home for a long time, and I knew what it meant to share a space with other people's rhythms. When my daughter-in-law came in, she looked surprised to see me already up. "Oh," she said, then she smiled again, that same correct smile. "You didn't have to do that." "I don't mind," I told her. My son came in a few minutes later, hair still damp from the shower, and he kissed the top of my head the way he did when he was a boy and thought I was unbreakable. For a little while, it felt like a fresh start. Like I was lucky. And maybe that's why I didn't notice, at first, how quickly helping could start to mean expected. The first few weeks settled into a rhythm that felt almost comforting. I woke before everyone else, as I always had. My body didn't know how to do anything else. I would sit at the small kitchen table with my coffee and watch the morning come through the windows, the light sliding across the floor inch by inch. Sometimes I folded a dish towel that didn't need folding, just to keep my hands busy. Old habits like to prove they still have a purpose. My daughter-in-law insisted I didn't need to do anything. "Please," she said one morning when she caught me rinsing my cup. "You're our guest." Guest is a strange word when you don't know how long you're supposed to stay. I thanked her and stepped back, embarrassed, as if I'd been caught doing something improper. I remember thinking that it was kind of her, that she was trying to protect me from myself. That's what I told myself then. That she didn't want me to feel useful out of obligation. But usefulness doesn't disappear quietly. It lingers. By the second week, I noticed small shifts. Nothing dramatic. Just details. If I wiped the counter after breakfast, no one stopped me. If I folded a load of towels that came out of the dryer, my daughter-in-law would say, "Oh, thank you," in a distracted way, already moving on to something else. My son didn't comment at all. He kissed my cheek, grabbed his keys, and left for work. It felt natural to help. It always had. I told myself that this was how families worked, everyone doing a little, everyone carrying something. I started cooking dinner 2 nights a week without anyone asking. Simple meals. Nothing fancy. Soup, roasted chicken, things my hands knew by memory. My daughter-in-law ate quietly, complimented the food, and stacked her plate in the sink. My son told me it tasted like home, and I smiled even though something in my chest tightened when he said it. Home had changed locations, and I wasn't sure where I fit inside it anymore. Laundry came next. I noticed the basket filling up faster than I expected. Towels, jeans, shirts. It didn't seem right to let it sit there. The washing machine was newer than mine, but I figured it out easily enough. I sorted the colors, measured the soap carefully, and waited. The basement was cool, and the light buzzed faintly overhead. When I carried the clean clothes upstairs, my arms ached in a way that surprised me. My daughter-in-law glanced up from her phone. "You really don't have to do that," she said again. "I know," I replied. "I don't mind." And that was true. Or at least, it was easier to believe it was true than to ask what would happen if I stopped. There were moments when I felt invisible in a way I hadn't before. Not ignored exactly. More like accounted for. As if my presence had already been assigned a role, and everyone assumed I understood it. Sometimes, when my son came home late, I would hear their voices in the living room. Low, tired, adult voices. I didn't listen on purpose, but sound travels in houses, and certain tones carry. My name would come up occasionally, usually followed by silence. Then conversation would resume, lighter, as if something had been set aside. I told myself it was nothing. That I was being sensitive. Age does that, people say. It makes you imagine edges where there are none. I believed that explanation because it was easier than believing there was something else forming quietly around me. And I kept doing the laundry. The first time I felt truly unsure of myself, it was over something small. I had finished folding a load of laundry and placed the stacks neatly on the couch, planning to carry them upstairs in a moment. My knees had been stiff that day, and I told myself it was sensible to rest before climbing the steps. When I came back into the living room, the stacks were gone. I stood there longer than I needed to, looking at the empty cushions. At first, I assumed I had already taken them upstairs and simply forgotten. That kind of thing happens, I reminded myself. I walked slowly up the steps, holding the railing, and checked the bedrooms. The clothes were there, put away. Folded differently than I folded them. Shirts smoothed in a way that suggested efficiency rather than care. I stared at them longer than necessary, trying to remember if I had done that. When I came back down, my daughter-in-law was in the kitchen. "I thought I left the laundry out," I said, lightly, as if it were a joke. "But I guess I took it up already." She didn't look at me right away. "Oh," she said after a moment. I grabbed it. "You were sitting, and I figured I'd save you the trip." Her tone was casual, reasonable. The kind of explanation that closes a door quietly. I smiled, embarrassed. "I must not remember." She glanced at me then, briefly. Not unkindly. Just observant. "It's okay," she said. "It happens. It happens." The words settled somewhere inside me and stayed there. After that, I began to notice how often I questioned my own memory. Not in big ways. Just little ones. Did I already wipe the table? Had I already started the dishwasher? Did I leave the light on, or did someone else turn it off? Once, I couldn't find the sweater I liked to wear in the evenings. The soft one my sister had given me years ago. I looked through my drawer twice, then a third time, feeling foolish. When I finally asked, my daughter-in-law said she'd moved it to a different shelf to make room. "I probably told you," she added. "You've had a lot on your mind." I nodded. Of course she had told me. I was the one who had forgotten. My son noticed none of this. Or if he did, he didn't say anything. When I mentioned being tired, he told me I was doing too much and should rest more. When I said I felt a little mixed up, he laughed gently and said, "Mom, you're fine. You worry too much." Worry. Age. Fatigue. There were explanations for everything, and I accepted them all because they came from people who loved me. Or at least, people who said they did. Still, I started keeping track in my head. Quietly. Not writing anything down. Just noting things. The way the trash was taken out before I remembered doing it. The way the counter was wiped after I had already wiped it. The way my efforts seemed to disappear and then return, rearranged, corrected. Once, I asked my daughter-in-law if she preferred I stop doing the laundry. She looked genuinely surprised. "Why would you stop?" I didn't have a good answer. So I kept going. And every time something felt slightly off, I told myself the same thing. I thought it was my age. I began to apologize more. Not for anything specific. Just in general. For being in the way. For asking questions that already had answers. For moving too slowly through rooms that were not built for hesitation. "I'm sorry," I said one afternoon when my daughter-in-law reached past me to get a pan from the cabinet. I hadn't realized I was standing there too long, deciding which one to use. She smiled, but there was a thinness to it now. "You don't have to apologize so much." That only made me more aware of it. I started paying attention to how often decisions were made around me without including me. Dinner plans discussed while I was in the room, but not addressed. Groceries appearing in the refrigerator without anyone asking what I liked. My routines adjusted gently, invisibly, until they no longer felt like mine. If I cooked, it was appreciated, but corrected. A little less salt next time. The oven runs hot. We usually eat earlier. None of it said sharply. Just stated. Practical. Efficient. Once, I noticed a note on the washing machine. A small piece of paper taped near the buttons, listing the preferred settings for different loads. Whites. Towels. Delicates. I stared at it longer than I should have. "I thought it might help," my daughter-in-law said when she saw me looking. "In case it's confusing." Confusing. I laughed softly, because laughing is what you do when you don't want to argue. "I've been doing laundry longer than you've been alive," I said, and immediately wished I hadn't. She stiffened, just slightly. "I know," she replied. "I just thought it would make things easier." Easier for whom, I didn't ask. That evening, my son sat beside me on the couch while the television murmured in the background. I told him, carefully, that sometimes I felt unsure of myself. That I felt like I was always one step behind. He sighed and rubbed his face. "Mom," he said, "no one thinks that. You're just adjusting. This is a big change." He didn't look at me when he said it. His eyes stayed on the screen. I let it drop. After that, I stopped bringing things up. I told myself that peace was more important than clarity. That making waves at my age was unnecessary. That families adapt, and sometimes adaptation feels like loss. Still, the word accident began to appear more often. If something was misplaced, it was an accident. If a dish broke, an accident. If plans changed without telling me, an accident. Always said kindly. Always with a smile. Always followed by reassurance. I accepted those explanations because challenging them would have meant challenging my own uncertainty. And I wasn't ready to do that. Late at night, in my room, I would sit on the edge of the bed and try to replay the day. I went over conversations in my mind, searching for something solid. Something that proved I was still capable of understanding my own life. Most nights, I fell asleep before I found it. And in the morning, I woke up and did the laundry again. By the time I noticed the pattern, I was already deep inside it. It wasn't one moment. It never is. It was the way the same things kept happening, dressed up as different days. The way my efforts were acknowledged and then quietly absorbed, as if they belonged to the house more than they belonged to me. The way my presence was useful, but my opinions were optional. I realized one afternoon, standing at the sink, that I had stopped asking before doing things. Not because I felt confident, but because I felt preemptively corrected. It was easier to act and accept whatever adjustment followed than to ask and be guided like a child. That thought startled me. I rinsed a plate and watched the water run over my hands. They were thinner than they used to be. The veins more visible. My wedding ring spun loosely around my finger. I remembered these hands packing lunches, scrubbing floors, folding clothes late at night while my children slept. They had not always been this uncertain. Later that day, I overheard my daughter-in-law on the phone. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was in the hallway, and her voice carried. "She means well," she said. "But she forgets things. It's nothing serious." There was a pause, then a small laugh. "No, no. Just little accidents." I stood there, my heart beating louder than it should have. She hadn't said anything cruel. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't even sounded annoyed. That was what made it worse. It sounded settled. Decided. That evening, I asked my son if he thought I was forgetting things. He hesitated just long enough for me to notice. "Everyone forgets things," he said finally. "You're tired. You do a lot." I nodded. I didn't press him. Pressing would have required him to choose, and I had already learned that silence was his way of avoiding that. From then on, I paid closer attention. Not with suspicion. With care. The way you watch your footing on an unfamiliar path. I noticed that when something went wrong, the explanation came quickly, already formed. Accident. Misunderstanding. Timing. Nothing worth worrying about. I noticed that my daughter-in-law often spoke for me. She doesn't mind. She already said it was fine. She probably forgot. Probably. The word followed me. Once, I suggested we rotate chores differently. Just casually. My daughter-in-law smiled and said, "Let's not change things right now. We've finally got a system that works." Works. I didn't ask who it worked for. That night, I lay in bed and tried to remember when the house had stopped feeling shared. When I had started feeling like a function instead of a person. I told myself not to dramatize. That this was simply the adjustment everyone talked about. That growing older meant stepping back, letting others take over. Still, something inside me resisted that explanation. Not loudly. Just enough to keep me awake. The tension didn't arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, like dust you don't see until the light hits it a certain way. I began to notice how often my daughter-in-law corrected me in front of others. Not harshly. Gently. The way you correct someone when you want to appear helpful. If I told a story from my son's childhood, she would step in with details. Dates adjusted. Ages clarified. I think it was actually. She'd say, smiling, as if accuracy were a shared hobby. I laughed it off. Memory is a strange thing, I told myself. It bends. But after a while, I stopped telling stories. When neighbors came by, my daughter-in-law spoke about my routines as if I weren't in the room. She gets tired in the afternoons. She likes simple meals now. She doesn't really watch much TV anymore. Each statement was close enough to the truth to feel harmless. Together, they formed something else. A version of me that was quieter, smaller, easier to manage. My son listened. He nodded. He didn't contradict her. Silence, I learned, can sound like agreement when it goes on long enough. One evening, I misplaced my reading glasses. I searched the living room, then my bedroom, then the kitchen. I felt the familiar prickle of embarrassment rise in my chest. When I finally asked for help, my daughter-in-law found them on the coffee table. "See," she said lightly. "Right where you were sitting." I looked at the table. I was certain they hadn't been there before. Certain in the way you're certain about things that matter, even when you know certainty isn't proof. "I must have missed them," I said. She didn't respond. She just smiled, the conversation already finished in her mind. That was the night I started writing things down. Not accusations. Not theories. Just notes. Times. Small details. The kind of record you keep when you're afraid your own mind might betray you. I hid the notebook in my dresser drawer, beneath folded sweaters. I felt foolish doing it, like a woman playing detective in her own family. But I also felt calmer, as if I had placed a small anchor in reality. Nothing dramatic happened right away. The notes accumulated slowly. Laundry done twice. Groceries moved. Comments repeated. Always the same explanations. Accident. Forgetting. Miscommunication. I told myself I was being careful, not suspicious. That there was a difference. And then came the first moment I couldn't explain away. It was late afternoon. I was alone in the house, folding clothes. I finished and placed them on the couch, exactly as before. This time, I sat and watched them. I didn't move. I didn't look away. They stayed where I put them. When my daughter-in-law came home, she paused when she saw them. "Oh," she said. "I was going to take care of that." "I already did," I replied. There was a flicker in her expression. Gone quickly. But real. "That's fine," she said. "I'll just check them later." She never did. That night, I wrote the time down carefully. And for the first time, I didn't blame my age. Once I began writing things down, the days took on a different shape. I still did the same tasks. I cooked. I cleaned. I folded. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inside, I moved more slowly, more deliberately. I paid attention to what happened before and after each small action, the way you do when you're trying to understand a language you were never taught. The notebook didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel sad. There is something deeply lonely about documenting your own life because you no longer trust the people sharing it with you. I kept the notes factual. No feelings. No interpretations. Just what happened. Tuesday. Laundry folded at 3:10 p.m. left on couch. Still there at 4 p.m. Thursday. Glasses placed on nightstand before dinner. Missing at 8:30. Found on kitchen counter at 8:45. Every time something didn't line up, the same explanation arrived before I could ask. Accident. Probably moved. You might not remember. I stopped responding to those explanations. I simply nodded. My son grew quieter around me. Not distant exactly. Just careful. As if there were things he didn't want to step into. When my daughter-in-law spoke about me, he let her. When she corrected me, he stayed out of it. Silence became his contribution to the household. One evening, after dinner, I heard them talking in their bedroom. The door wasn't fully closed. I hadn't meant to listen, but my name drifted out again. She insists on doing everything, my daughter-in-law said. And then she gets confused. There was a pause. Then my son sighed. She's always been stubborn. That word sat heavily with me. I had been many things in my life. Stubborn was not how I would have described myself. Capable. Responsible. Steady. Those were the words people used when they needed something done. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering when capability had turned into inconvenience. The proof didn't arrive like a revelation. It crept in through repetition. One afternoon, I checked the notebook and noticed something I hadn't before. The timing. Certain things only went missing when my daughter-in-law was home. When she wasn't, the house behaved normally. Objects stayed where I left them. Tasks remained completed. I didn't write that conclusion down. I only wrote the times. A few days later, I tested it without meaning to. She was out running errands. I folded laundry and left it in plain sight. It stayed untouched until she returned. Then, within minutes, she approached it. "Oh," she said, reaching for the stack. "I'll take it," I said calmly, picking it up before she could. Her hand lingered in the air for a moment, then dropped. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's okay," she said. "I was just trying to help." I nodded and walked away. That evening, I opened the notebook again. My hands shook slightly as I wrote, not from fear, but from the weight of what I was slowly allowing myself to see. The betrayal wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel in the way people imagine cruelty. It was quiet. Organized. Wrapped in concern. And I understood then that whatever this was, it had been happening for longer than I wanted to admit. I didn't confront anyone right away. Knowing something and saying something are very different acts, especially when you're old enough to understand the cost of both. I carried the knowledge quietly, the way you carry a fragile thing you're not sure you're allowed to own. The notebook grew thicker. Not in pages, but in meaning. I began noticing patterns beyond objects. Tone. Timing. The way my daughter-in-law's concern appeared most clearly when others were present. How she would gently touch my arm while explaining something about me, as if anchoring me in place. "She gets overwhelmed," she told my son's sister one afternoon while I sat at the table. "We're trying to keep things simple for her." I looked up, surprised. Overwhelmed by what, I wondered. The sentence had already moved past me. My son's sister smiled politely and nodded. No one asked me anything. Later, when I mentioned it to my son, he frowned. "She's just trying to help, Mom. You know that?" I did know that. Or at least, I knew that was the explanation everyone preferred. The proof I gathered was not dramatic. It wouldn't convince a stranger. It was only convincing to someone who had lived inside the pattern long enough to recognize its shape. I found my notebook one evening not where I had left it. It was still hidden, still tucked away, but the sweaters above it were folded differently. Not badly. Just differently. I sat on the bed for a long time, holding the notebook in my lap, my thumb pressed against the worn edge. I hadn't written anything accusatory. There was nothing to be offended by. And yet, someone had looked. At dinner, my daughter-in-law asked me how I was feeling. "Fine," I said. She studied me for a moment. "You've been quieter." "So have you," I replied, gently. My son cleared his throat and changed the subject. That night, I added one more note. Not a time. Not an object. Notebook moved. The next day, I stopped doing the laundry. Not as a statement. I simply didn't pick up the basket. I let it sit. When my daughter-in-law noticed, she commented on it casually. "Oh, don't worry about that," she said. "I'll handle it." The relief in her voice was small, but unmistakable. That was when I understood the final piece. It wasn't about confusion. It wasn't even about control in the way people talk about control. It was about narrative. About who got to decide what kind of woman I was becoming. I wasn't losing my abilities. I was losing authorship, and once you realize someone else is editing your life, you can't unsee the marks they leave behind. The confrontation, when it came, didn't announce itself. There was no raised voice. No slammed doors. Just a sentence spoken too carelessly to be taken back. It was a Sunday afternoon. My son was home, sitting at the table with paperwork spread out in front of him. I was making tea, moving slowly, deliberately. My daughter-in-law stood near the counter, scrolling through her phone. I asked, gently, "Did you move my notebook?" The room went very quiet. My daughter-in-law looked up first. "What notebook?" The answer came too quickly. "The one in my dresser," I said. I kept my voice even. Calm. Under my sweaters. My son looked between us, confused. "Mom, what notebook?" I took a breath. I write things down sometimes. So I don't forget. There it was. The opening. My daughter-in-law smiled, the practiced one. "Oh. That," she laughed softly. "I thought it was just lists. I was putting your clothes away and saw it." "You opened it," I said. "I glanced," she corrected. I was concerned. Concern again. Always concern. "You didn't mention it," I said. "I didn't want to upset you," she replied. "You get anxious." My son shifted in his chair. "Mom, she was just trying to help." I nodded. I had expected that. "I'd like to know," I said, "why my things keep moving when I don't move them." Silence. My daughter-in-law's smile faded, just slightly. "Things get moved in a house," she said. "That's normal." "Only when you're home," I replied. The air changed then. Not dramatically. Just enough to be felt. She crossed her arms. "Are you saying I'm doing something on purpose?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at my son. He didn't look back. "I'm saying," I said finally, "that I don't like being told I forgot things I remember." She exhaled, slow and controlled. "We've been patient," she said. "You've been under a lot of stress." "Patient?" My son rubbed his temples. "Mom, please. This isn't going anywhere good." And that was the moment I understood how alone I was. Because what I was asking for was small. Recognition. Honesty. What I was being offered instead was management. "I don't need to be managed," I said quietly. No one responded. The conversation ended the way these conversations always do. With discomfort smoothed over, and nothing resolved. That evening, the laundry basket was full again. After that afternoon, the house changed its tone. Not in obvious ways. Meals were still cooked. Doors still opened and closed. Conversation still happened. But everything moved with a carefulness that hadn't been there before, like furniture rearranged just enough that you had to watch your steps. My daughter-in-law became gentler. That may sound like a kindness. It wasn't. Her voice softened when she spoke to me. She asked if I was tired more often. If I needed help. If I remembered what day it was. Each question carried the weight of the one before it, stacking quietly, building a version of concern that felt rehearsed. My son watched this with a tight expression. He didn't intervene. He didn't agree outright either. He hovered somewhere in between, which was worse. It meant that every interaction felt observed, evaluated. One evening, after dinner, my daughter-in-law cleared the table while I sat still, my hands folded. I hadn't offered to help. She didn't ask. "We're thinking," she said casually, "that maybe it would be better if we took over some things completely. Just so you don't feel pressure." Pressure. I looked at her. I didn't say I felt pressured. She smiled. "I know. But sometimes people don't realize it." My son stared at his plate. That night, I wrote in the notebook again. Not about objects this time. About words. The way language had begun to tilt against me, shaping conclusions I hadn't agreed to. The next morning, I overheard my son on the phone with his sister. "I don't know," he said quietly. "She thinks we're moving her stuff. But you know Mom. She gets ideas." Ideas. When I walked into the room, he stopped talking. He smiled too quickly. "Hey, Mom." I smiled back. From then on, every disagreement was framed as concern for me. Every boundary I tried to draw was treated as resistance. My daughter-in-law spoke calmly, reasonably, always emphasizing how much she wanted what was best for me. It was exhausting to argue against kindness. I stopped pushing. Not because I believed them, but because I saw where it led. The more I insisted on my reality, the more they questioned it. The more I questioned them, the more they closed ranks. The house had chosen its story. I felt myself shrinking inside it. And still, the tidal moment hadn't arrived yet. Not the words. Not the act. Just the slow tightening of expectation, the unspoken sense that my usefulness had become my obligation. I waited, quietly, because by then I understood something important. When people are certain you won't leave, they stop being careful. The words came on an ordinary morning. That's what stays with me now, that nothing about the day warned me. The sun was already up. The house smelled faintly of coffee. I was standing in the laundry room, holding a damp shirt, deciding whether to hang it or put it in the dryer. My hands hesitated longer than they used to. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I had learned that decisions could be corrected later. My daughter-in-law walked in behind me. I didn't hear her at first. She stopped when she saw what I was doing. "Oh no," she said, sharply enough that it startled me. "Don't do that." I turned, confused. "It's still wet," she sighed. Not loudly. Just enough to register. "This is what I mean." "What do you mean?" I asked. She picked up a rag from the counter, one I had used earlier to wipe up a spill, and tossed it into the basket with more force than necessary. "From now on," she said, "cooking and laundry are all yours. Stop freeloading." The word hung in the air between us. Freeloading. I stood very still. My mind didn't rush to anger. It went somewhere quieter. Somewhere stunned. "I've been doing the cooking," I said slowly. "And the laundry." She crossed her arms. "Exactly. That's what you're good at. Let's not complicate things." My son appeared in the doorway then. He had heard his name in the tension, if not the words. "What's going on?" he asked. "Nothing," she mouthed to him. I looked at him. I waited. He didn't say anything. That was the moment something in me finally settled, not broke, not exploded, just settled, heavy and final. Because I understood then that all the concern, all the corrections, all the accidents had been leading here. To a role clearly defined. To usefulness without dignity. To a place where my presence had to justify itself through labor. I nodded. "All right," I said. Not because I agreed. Because I was done explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. That afternoon, I packed a small bag. Not to leave. Just to feel capable of it. At dinner, no one mentioned what had happened. My daughter-in-law spoke about her day. My son nodded. The food tasted the same as always. But the house felt different. Trust doesn't disappear in a dramatic way. It thins. It frays. It stops returning when you reach for it. That night, I sat on my bed and looked at the notebook one last time. I didn't add anything. Some records are no longer for proof. They're just reminders. I stayed. That surprises some people when I tell them later, though I don't tell it often. They expect a leaving. A declaration. A final line drawn in the sand. But by the time you reach my age, you understand that not all endings look like exits. The days after that morning passed quietly. I cooked. I did the laundry. I did them well, the way I always had. No one corrected me anymore. There were no notes on the machine. No hovering. No concern-laced questions. I had been placed where I apparently belonged, and the tension eased once the role was accepted. My daughter-in-law thanked me more often. My son seemed relieved. The house found its balance again. I did not. Something inside me had shifted, and it did not move back. I stopped sharing small thoughts. I stopped telling stories. I stopped explaining myself even in harmless ways. When people decide you are fragile, every word you offer becomes something they feel responsible for managing. Silence, I learned, was the only thing that still belonged entirely to me. My notebook stayed in the drawer. I didn't add to it. I didn't need to anymore. Proof has a short life once belief is gone. Sometimes my daughter-in-law would ask if I was tired. I would say no. Sometimes my son would ask if I was happy there. I would say I was fine. Both answers were true in the narrowest sense. I watched the house the way you watch something that no longer asks anything of you emotionally. I noticed details without attaching meaning to them. The way people move when they believe the situation is settled. The way voices soften when resistance disappears. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the laundry room window. The light hit my face at an angle that made me look older than I felt. Or perhaps closer to how I had begun to feel. Useful. Quiet. Contained. I thought about my old house. About how lonely it had been, and how I had mistaken loneliness for the worst thing that could happen to me. It wasn't. The worst thing was realizing that being surrounded by people doesn't protect you from being diminished. I didn't confront anyone again. There was nothing left to confront. The story had already been written, and I was no longer one of its authors. Some evenings, when the house was quiet, I would sit and fold clothes slowly, carefully, making each crease deliberate. Not for them. For myself. A way of reminding my hands that they still knew what they were doing, even if the world around them had decided otherwise. Trust, once thinned enough, doesn't announce its absence. It simply stops being something you reach for. And there are things like that in life. Once they leave, they don't return to what they were.